We only have one screen, so
That works.
it's not ideal, so. Ready
Yeah.
to go?
I'll still kind of took the oomph out of the gavel.
Sorry.
We'll call the meeting to order. We will start off with just a roll call. McKee here, Colts
Here.
Camp
Here.
Nichols
Here.
and Counselor Bottom is excused on his way. We'll just jump right into the work session.
Excellent. I'm gonna hand it over to Matt.
All right, thank you, Mayor and Council. So as you know, for the last year, we've been trying to evaluate recruitment and retention options for our police department. It's been an issue that's experienced pretty dramatically statewide, nationwide, and it is something that we felt the pinch of here as well. And we've been trying to be proactive in every way that we can. We're seeing a lot of agencies become very creative in trying to recruit officers from other departments. So I mean, essentially within the profession, different agencies are kind of eating their own right now. And there's not, we can look at the amount of people going through the law enforcement programs, and there's simply not enough people coming through to fill the vacancies. So you have one police department stealing from another and kind of this round robin, and where agencies and cities have really broken down the barriers that people would not have left for in the past. So in the past, it would have been things like seniority and accruals and wages, things like that, that you would not see people leaving one city to go to another one. Now, with most cities, you can come in with lateral entry. Many of them are granting service credits for other time served. Some cities are doing as much as $10,000 signing bonuses given over time. And so I think as we started this conversation within the city a year ago, it was what can we do to further our goals that we've always wanted to be a good place to work. We also recognize the reality that we're not going to be the highest paying agency in the state. So what can we do to kind of continue to be better so that we're an attractive place for other people to come work. And I think we do great on that level as a community. I think we've all experienced the community support, the council support. You speak to the officers and most of them, they feel that appreciation that this is the type of place that they want to work. And then on the flip side, what can we do as far as compensation or benefits to get people to come here, but also to retain people from leaving. We've had separations in the past historically, as contrary to what a lot of people might think. People would have believed that Corcoran would be a training ground for Maple Grove, Plymouth, or bigger cities. And that really hasn't been the case for many years. Corcoran was blessed to have very long time serving officers, a couple already that are coming up on 30 years in the late 20s. And it's, I think, only in recent history, and this was prior to my time here, one person left to go to the DNR previously. But you didn't get people leaving Corcoran for other police departments. We're starting to see a little bit of shift in sentiment as the profession has changed. You're not having police officers spend their entire career in one place anymore. And people have the ability, and just with generational differences, the desire to do something new, see something different. So that's what we're up against. And so as we look at how do we retain that stability that we had, and how do we stay competitive with agencies that might pay more or might have other opportunities to offer? So that was kind of what this was rooted in. And so in June was the first work session where we had talked about this. Leading into that June work session, I had surveyed the officers and said, what are some ideas that you have? Compiled them, I think, into about 13 different items. Those were brought to the council it was either 13 or 11 of them were brought to the council in June. And just to get some feedback from the council. And the feedback at that meeting that I received from the council was, we'd be willing to discuss any of these items, but what is the value to the officers? And how do we want to rank order these? Sometimes the most expensive isn't the most valuable. Also, the most valuable isn't always the most value to the officers. So out of that discussion came a survey subcommittee. Jeremy and John both had some ideas on how they wanted to kind of analyze the data and the information coming back. So we formulated a survey and the format of the survey. That survey and the results were included in your packet. The officers were told that they could only choose 8 of the items from there. It was a forced prioritization, that there would inevitably be some that would not get votes. And then of the ones that were there, to provide a score of them. So from 1 to 10, with 10 being the most. And so what we would then be able to do is evaluate which of the 8 were the most important to the workforce, and then how they valued each of those items. And just as a, a tidbit of information, we included, how many years they had served to see if there was any variations there as it might relate to retention versus recruitment. And the instructions on the survey ask them to evaluate these based on the value to them personally, not what they thought somebody else would want. So it was really a firsthand experience as to what kind of value is being provided. We also were instructed to kind of drill down on, keep working on some of the financial part and do some of the little bit more legwork as to what the true costs of a lot of the items are going to be. And we kind of, in looking at that, found that we needed to split it out in an adoption cost versus a carrying cost. Because some of them would have money to start up, other ones wouldn't. And some would include a carrying cost, some wouldn't. So in this survey, you'll see there's different options that were shown. So for instance, the retirement health insurance, it shows it how it would score a 300 a month, 200 a month, 150 a month. And these are all sample numbers, with any of these dates, when we talk about one of them being the sabbatical, the council can elect to do different dates, different dollar amounts, which can also change the outputs on the right side. But what we did is we took what we had seen in other agencies as we evaluated them. So for instance, the paid sabbatical, that shown at a 30-day option, a 21-day option, and what the annual carrying cost would be to do that. Same thing with options on the retirement health insurance and so on. As you work right on the spreadsheet, are you able to zoom in on that, Jess?
Yeah.
Does your cost factor in not only the benefit, but the cost to administer it? Because some of these, like a vacation reimbursement, somehow you're gonna have to track that is actually used for actually vacation.
Yeah, so I think what the initial thought on that would be is similar to, we reimburse employees for FSA spending or for some receive cell phone stipends. We already have the process in place where employees turn in receipts and the expense form to show what it's for. So, for instance, I set aside money for dependent care.
Right.
It's a set dollar amount. So our finance already tracks reimbursables. I'm going to be one additional reimbursable that they would have to track.
Right, but there's a cost to doing that, right?
Yes,
So
I think that would probably, I don't think it would be too onerous. I mean, it would be staff hours of maybe, I don't know, probably not more than 5-10 hours a year, but depending on how frequently they were submitted for. But no, I think those hours were not included in there. That was figured simply as, and again, these numbers on the annual carrying cost are as it relates to police. If the council were to look at extrapolating this out across the city, then it would go up proportionally. And so as we looked at it, the surveys are labeled S1, S2, all the way up through S11 across the top from the different police officer surveys. The total benefit points is the total scores that those items received. The next one over with number of selections shows how many people actually selected that item for their ranking. We put the average score by the person or by the selectors, the people who had selected it. And then we calculated the carrying cost per benefit point. So for instance, we looked at the total benefit points and you're dividing that out from the carrying cost. So, keep in mind that you could change the carrying cost on any item and divide it by the benefit points and change the color coding. So for instance, they were color coded as the ones that finished in the top 30% of the options by rating. And that's separate how many were in the top 30% of total benefit options. Those have their own color coding versus the number of selected is its own color coding. The average score by selector are all color coded, and the carrying cost per benefit point are all independently color coded. If they finished in the top 30%, they got green. If they were in the middle 40%, they were colored yellow. If they were in the bottom 30%, they were red. And what you'll see is commonality of like for instance, the top one, the total benefit points it got finished in the top 30%. The number of selectors was in the top 30%. The average score by selector was in the top 30%. And on the $250, and then on the 21-day option that finished in the green as well. So it's not, they weren't painted horizontally, they were painted by box. And there's a lot of commonalities in the ones that also had the most benefit points, the average score, and the carrying cost per benefit point. That being said, you could, by changing the annual carrying cost with the total benefit points, there's probably a way that you could get every carrying cost per benefit point into the green just by manipulating your inputs and outputs to just change your dollar amount. These dollar amounts were set by what we think the best practice might be for doing that, or what we've seen in other agencies. So when we look at the hiring referral bonuses, you know, we used a $10,000 estimate here that ended up scoring in the bottom 30% for the number total benefit points it received from the officers, bottom 30% for number of people that selected it, bottom 30% for average score by selector, but actually went up to the mid-range for the value analysis. If you lowered that amount, the amount of cost to the city, you might actually be able to get that into the green. So just, you know, keep that in mind. There are inputs and outputs for every one of these calculations. So it's not, none of them are set in stone. This was kind of really created as a way to analyze what the perceived value of the officers was as it was somewhat presented. And I think what we found is, surprisingly, even some of the more expensive ones weren't the ones that always scored the highest either. So as I put in the staff report, I think the three that seem to provide the best value would be the paid sabbatical, the vacation reimbursement, and the retirement health insurance contributions. There is nuances in each one of them as to how that would be administered and what it would look like. And that would be if whatever the council decides to consider, we'd have to talk about the details on it. So one of the things that we talked about, for instance, was that's a little bit more complex, would be the additional health insurance contributions. I think one of the conversations that we had in the initial work session and also in the subcommittee, I think a format for that would not be as an accrued benefit, but as an entitlement upon separation. So that way it would only be, you'd have to meet certain criteria if you were entitled to the health insurance contribution upon retirement. And the council could set those. Maybe it would be something like minimum of 10 years of service, minimum of 55 years of age or 50 years of age, whatever that might be. And the employee provides the city with notice of pension withdrawal from para to show that they're actually leaving the profession as opposed to leaving for another agency. So we'd have to spell out what those criteria were. We'd probably want to be pretty articulate with it. But what that would do is two things. If the city set that as 55, you would retain people that would normally be leaving in that 52, 53, that you would keep people there a little bit longer. But it would also create a loss for those that decided to leave in the middle of their career, because they could look at that and say, well, if I'm walking away to an agency that has a $10,000 signing bonus, but I'm also walking away from $10,000 today in health insurance benefits because I've been here for 10 years or whatever that calculation might be.
That one to me seemed to have the most direct retention.
Right. And at that point, so one of the things to consider on that one as well, that the carrying cost is calculated by in these numbers. If we looked at, for instance, the 150 per month, that 23,400 is the cost of funding it. If we gave no previous service credit and funded it fully, each officer, the city put $150 in an account and actually were to fully fund that liability. What we know is that we couldn't fully fund that liability today, and that's what it would cost us. However, if you're only receiving it on retirement, we couldn't incur that liability today. I mean, the only people that, by whatever criteria we set up, that would be eligible for retirement would maybe be one officer in the department. And the second one wouldn't reach that for another 4 to 5 years, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, when people elected not to, either for whatever reason didn't get that benefit, whether they separated for a different reason or weren't eligible when they left, that would eventually become overfunded. So this funding is actually a worst case scenario if we were to provide no service credit. Now, the other option that you could look at is you could fund it at that amount, knowing that whatever criteria you put into effect, officers wouldn't be eligible to reach that. That fund would build up and you could actually backdate the benefit to create incentive now. So if we had, for instance, if you wanted the council elected to, you could say, we're going to give 5 years of service credit if an officer was here 5 years ago. Or you can say the start accrual date of that benefit was in 2018. So an officer today would have 5 years of credit. So if you had even a 15 or 20-year officer that was looking at leaving, they would have 5 years worth of that benefit that they would be walking away from, that they would have an entitlement to. So that's kind of the nuances or the discussion in the health insurance. I think we would probably work with our city attorney on very carefully crafting something like that. The other conversations around the other two recommendations being the vacation reimbursement, which was recommended at $1,500 a year. Council could say $1,000, could say $2,000. That number can change as well. I would recommend that we would allow people to carry it over for up to 3 years. So that way a person could, you know, if a family wanted to do something, or
How about 4, so it matches a sabbatical?
yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, that you could use it in conjunction with the sabbatical. That way a person, you know, we can put whatever expectations we would want on there. If a person takes sabbatical, it's, you know, expected. I don't know how we would put those in place, but the focus would be on employee self-care, and maybe they take, part of that is you take your family to Disney World, or you're, you know, taking a trip to Europe with someone, or that you're getting that chance to unplug and truly focus on the root of what the sabbatical is intended for. That idea came out of mental health recommendations from Ridgway and Associates. I think there's at least one agency in Minnesota that does it. I know a handful of others were talking about it, and there could be more. I'm not sure. I know for sure of one that's doing it. But I think the sabbatical in conjunction with the vacation reimbursement would be a very powerful recruitment tool that not many other cities can offer. I can tell you that when I met with the Maple Grove chief last week, he had heard that I was presenting to council on this and asked for all the details on it, because he wanted to do some of them. And I said, you can't see them till my council sees them. But I'm guessing he's probably printed off the packet, and these are things that a lot of other cities are considering. So those are kind of the ins and outs, or the ideas behind the top 3 that I was recommending the council consider adopting. And at the end, I recommended those 3. I do want to be clear. I'm not saying all 3 of them should start today. I would imagine, you know, what I would probably recommend is doing a phased approach where maybe the city started chose a starting point for the additional health insurance contributions now, and then said, you know what, we're going to start looking at sabbaticals next year, because we'll have brought on the other officer later this year. It'll help with staffing, and start rolling out some lead time that would help with both the budget and the planning. You know, if we wanted to, we wouldn't be able to do sabbaticals this year, just from a planning perspective. So, you know, same thing with the vacation reimbursements. And then obviously any of them would be a consideration for which of these, if the council were to consider it, should be appropriate for other city staff. You know, one of the things to consider is there are some city staff that retire at a different age than police, where they're eligible for Medicare. They maybe don't need post-retirement health insurance to the same degree that officers do, but maybe the vacation reimbursement you'd find does apply. You know, the sabbatical was in the lens of police officers, and that was based off of our provider, but you know, what is the application other places? I know Councilor Bottom shared that his company does sabbaticals. So those are kind of the talking points, and wanted to hear what the council's feedback and direction was on it. I don't know, Jess, if you have anything to add to it.
Yeah, I think it's, Matt did a great job outlining kind of the process and how we got here, and just understanding how this works for the department as well as other staff. If we were to look at these items, or a variety of different items, and coming up with that overall timeline, if it's a phased approach of how we do that.
And there is, I believe, some money set aside in the 23 budget to implement some of this already. There's other funding sources available. So I mean, when it gets to the what, we can probably try and figure out the how with some direction and feedback. But knowing that we had this work session in last June, there was consideration given this in the budget, and officers continue to contribute ideas. They haven't had the analysis that these have, but one of the officers brought up, you know, offering mental health spousal support and counseling for spouses of police officers, or morale building retreats for the police department, things like that. So this is something the officers have been watching closely. I know they asked repeatedly, when is this still moving? Where is this going? Where is this at? And they're very anxious to see what what comes out of it, and
Mhm.
tempered that with saying it's all being considered. We don't know if anything and what those might be, but I would anticipate some of them will probably be watching the work session.
Sounds good.
So from the subcommittee perspective, when John and I had our discussion with the chief most recently, we agreed with those top three selections, with the rationale being it's an investment not only in retention, but also in the mental health of the officers that we have. And in light of, the biggest sources of loss that we've had are, we had a few officers depart for because they found better opportunities. Some officers have had challenges with mental health in our force and other forces. So this is a nice way to deal with both of those in one stroke. So with the sabbatical and the vacation reimbursement, we're giving people a window of opportunity to refresh and revitalize. And it also would serve a retention benefit, because when you're 2 years in and you've got $3,000 banked and you're looking forward to a 2-week road trip out west with your kid, it's probably harder to attract that officer away. And then you get the refreshment benefit of that at a relatively short interval every 4 years, where those people get a chance to de-stress for a period of time. And then from a more direct retention perspective, that's where the additional retirement health insurance piece would come into play, where there's a direct financial incentive for staying as well.
Makes sense. Did you guys discuss at all of those three, which is also Matt's 3, or the overall 3 that we got from the data? In terms of, let's say we're going to do all of those. Any preference in implementation, which first, which, and like, did you get into any of that detail?
We didn't talk about the specific path we would follow, assuming there was support for all three.
Yeah.
Maybe that's something for all of us to discuss at this point. My input on that would be, I would probably begin with the vacation reimbursement personally. I don't know if the officers would agree that that's the highest retention value, but in terms of the cost per point, that's the most efficient one that we have, and the metric that we use, that was $221 per point of retention benefit. And it's also within I think it was 20,000 that we had allocated for this in 2023.
I can't remember off the top of my head, but
Something like that.
allocate.
Okay. No.
I have some questions. So were they given this narrative prior to the survey? So they may have based their answers on what's listed for examples.
Yes.
Okay. Side suggestion on the survey, I guess I wouldn't have asked them to put years of service. I would have had a band. Because you can kind of tell who's filling out some of these in some cases.
Yeah, and ultimately that could be public data if someone requests the actual surveys.
Yeah, but if you said you're 0 to 5 years, 5 to 10, or 10 plus, it leaves it more a little bit. What's the word I'm thinking of? Confidential. in that response.
Ambiguous.
Ambiguous, yes. They're big about ambiguous data these days. But so how do any of these, if we implement them, how do they affect our union negotiations with the police union? I mean,
They will.
So
I mean,
if
they
there's
could-
an item that's addressed in the contract, for instance, that would be something that would require an MOU. So if it's an accrued benefit, for instance, if the council were to say, we want to give the officers more PTO. PTO is outlined in the contract. Even if we wanted to give them more, we could not unless we reopen the contract, came to an agreement. The items on here, the only thing that's currently addressed in the contract would be the educational financial incentives, which is more of written as a reimbursement for class expenses. And I would assume the council would rather, if it were to look at that, reopen that language and have that. The other items, the city can offer other benefits to employees that are not included in the union contract. I would anticipate that a request from the union, once, if there were other items, and that is a standard practice, typically we'll try and roll them in the next contract. But I don't think we would be prevented from giving this additional benefit to the officers as long as it's not something that is outlined.
is there a way to define a benefit to keep it outside of that? I mean, they can ask for whatever they want, right? But can we write it into policy that this is a non-negotiable item?
We don't have to negotiate it into the contract.
We could just make
We
that
could
clear
say
in the
that-
next negotiation that
that
we don't want to
We
include.
aren't,
Right, we could say no.
Yeah,
and because it's a benefit that we provide separately, I don't think that we need.
The only concern I could see is that, for instance, like with the retirement health insurance, people would be financial planning throughout their career. They might be counting on and that entitlement as by when they're choosing to either put in less HSA funds or part of that. So I think we wouldn't want to. If it wasn't memorialized, you also, it's not something you'd want to say, well, we had a bad year this year. I'm sorry, we're flipping off the switch. Now, could, but I think that there would be, they would want some assurances that if they were doing financial planning based on it, that it was gonna follow through.
well, that's kind of another question that leads to, that becomes a defined contribution benefit, right? That we're obligated to pay year over year.
It depends on how it's structured. So I think the idea behind it was to structure it as a retirement entitlement, not an accrued benefit. So it would be a formulaic, if you retire from here, if you're 55, if you meet these 5 conditions.
Right, but it's a defined contribution that the city has to put in year over year over year, right? It's not discretionary in any way.
No, it would be described. I think that how the city chooses to fund it, the city could choose to fund it, the city could choose not to fund it and write that check at the end. I think that's more of the accounting behind the scenes. It would not become that employee's earned benefit, the $150, the way we would try and have it written. If that makes sense.
Kind of.
I think that we would. With all of these, there are things that we want to verify the language and work with the city attorney and potentially our labor attorney to make sure we're understanding how they interplay with the labor agreement as well as anything that we are doing in the handbook or anything like that. So that'll be an important next step, which it's meant.
Think of like funding the liability the same way we're funding our capital plan. Right, so we're reducing how much our liability is by how much cash we're setting aside. But we're not setting aside, when we set aside $25,000 this year, we're not setting that aside for the road grader. We're setting it aside for the capital accrual. So you can fund it, you don't have to tie your funding per person. You can tie it in bulk amounts. You can detach it from an earned benefit of an individual. So I'm looking at kind of funding a later liability. This would be the amount of so that the carrying cost would actually be the worst case liability incurred by the city, not so much a guaranteed debt. Because if they didn't qualify, they don't get it.
Right,
So I think that was where I was looking.
yeah, so it's more of a defined contribution. Well,
Be more of a defined.
it's not a defined benefit
benefit
because the benefits
formulaic.
is formulaic based on how much is put in and how much you come out.
Yeah, the benefit would be based on years of service. I think we wouldn't do the benefit based on dollars. We'd say your benefit is you'll receive $150 for each month of service, or we could structure it any way we wanted to, I think, but I think we would want to make sure that it wasn't written as an accrued benefit. And that's why I termed it as a entitlement or a retirement entitlement as opposed to an earned benefit. I think that
Yeah,
to your point, it would be some very technical, probably the way we would want to write it. We'd probably want to do that with our attorney.
yeah, I just want to make sure we don't get in a situation where if we have an economic downturn, we're squeezing every penny. That this isn't the first thing that gets chopped off, right? Because different from a road grader, nobody's going to be walking out the door. The road grader is still going to be sitting there.
Right. Well, that's where I was saying, I think, if we look at this funding, where if we were funding it at $23,000 a year, for instance, at 4 years, we would have, getting $100,000 in there, by the time that reaches $300,000 or $400,000, the city's probably going to want to turn off funding that liability because you can't, even, depending on when you're going to allow that accrual to start, the amounts for a 30-year career come out to be $30,000, $40,000. You would need 6 people to retire in a year, which just logically couldn't happen. So eventually if funding it at that rate, the city would likely eventually become overfunded on there. And it would probably make sense to turn off the contributions once you know what your potential liabilities could be. You can forecast saying, we have this employee, if every eligible employee were to leave right now today in our city, we have 1. And the next closest one is probably 5 years from now.
It's almost more like an endowment.
Yeah, and the next one from that is probably 10 years from now, before that, if we set the criteria at, we're drawing from drawing from your retirement, things like that, we couldn't incur enough liability. This is funding it as if every officer could leave and qualify, yet they cannot. If we're able to structure it with our attorney is in a way that's not an accrued benefit. The concerns would be as a person leaves under other circumstances, and what other circumstances could result in an entitlement to those funds. So I think we'd want to be, if we decide to go down that route, be very explicit that you would, if you want that check from the city, you have to provide the city with your notice of PERA pension drawing. And you can choose not to. The city then is not going to give it to you. We can draw out what those check boxes might be, but
How could this be impacted by if you have an officer that has to leave the force because of a medical early?
I think that's one of the things that we'd really have to look into. So they're entitled to health insurance benefit by state law, that we're required to provide that. It would be whether or not the term of that retirement fits the definition. So I don't know if their form that they would get from para from a medical separation is the same as a retirement due to aging out. And that same thing would be whether it's somebody blows out their knee or somebody, receives a mental injury. So I don't know the mechanics if we would be required, if they would be entitled to that. Now, where that might come into play is if we say an officer achieves the age of 55 years old, that might parse that out, unless they're over 55 and then blow out their knee or receive another injury, then they would be. But if we're able to put an age requirement as part of the criteria, that might insulate from that.
Would they receive the money into some kind of a tax-free vehicle? Like, would we put it into an HSA for them or something like that? Or what's the mechanics of the payout?
So right now, when an officer separates employment, all of their accruals roll into a health retirement savings account.
Okay.
And so I would envision this rolling with that upon their payouts with their other entitlements.
Yeah, that's something that we need to look into a little bit of how the mechanics would work with that as well. Wanted to get all of your feedback on which direction to go before exploring some of those. So there's some details to iron out.
Yeah, so for instance, like the PTO payouts go into a medical account for the officers, all of those items. So I would assume that this should be able to roll with that.
Yeah, we just have to work on the language that kind of outlines that project or that benefit. So.
Yeah, I'd want to make sure that with that benefit, we explore every option to know that we're not exposed to some type of premature withdrawal. We start having to draw down funds or have to actually increase funds to keep account at the proper level.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, cool.
I was just saying, I would be interested in looking more down that route and seeing probably talking to the city attorney or labor attorney, some sort, and vetting out what those specific criteria we need, but I'd be interested in it.
I was gonna ask about the sabbatical, get a better understanding of that. So they would earn 30 days after every 4 years of service?
No, I was not clear on, I did not write that well.
Okay,
What was intended was every 4 years of service, they would receive a 21-day sabbatical.
okay,
And so that was pointed out to me was by somebody else who had read the packet online saying, so if I've been here, 16 years, then I would get, 81 days. No, it's intended, and that was not written well in the description. I think the intent of what that was written was 21 days after they've completed 4 years, and then after completing another 4 years, they would receive another 21 day.
okay, so, and then it would be like what if after 4 years, they have 21 days any point between 4 years and on, they can use those 21 days?
We would, so I think, well, we would structure it as we would schedule it out because of staffing purposes. So for instance, what we would do is, when we decided to roll this out and said it was 2024, we'll start rolling it out by seniority. So one of the senior officers can receive a 21-day sabbatical. We would work with that officer to say, okay, here's the months we're going to probably exclude August, the months that we have the events where we would be short on staffing. So of these 9 months, Officer Warren, when would you like to go on sabbatical? We'd work with them, and then we would probably, most likely scenario is we'd reach out to one of our part-timers and say, would you be able to cover 3 weeks during this time? So we would try and eliminate as much bouncing around as possible, but our plan would be to backfill a majority of the shifts with part-time. There would be somewhere, if we had enough coverage, we might not backfill if we can save some money there, depending on what call demands would be, or.
So in year 4, I'm gonna play the hypothetical officer. Year 4 comes, I have 21 days, but I don't want to take it in year 4 because I know my family's gonna do X in year 5. Can I take it in year 5? And at year 5, do I accrue X amount of days additional, or is it just the 21?
How I would recommend setting it up is that people are required to take it in those within that window of that year, and that they're required to take the 21 days. I mean, if we're following the mental health benefit as they're talking about and saying it takes, 16 days or whatever to fully disconnect and rebuild. I think if we'd work with them for them to take it when they want to, but if you have a trip planned in year 5, we'd say you'll be able to use your PTO for that. And you can recommend that way, but I would say that we would probably stick to the time frame. Now it's up to the council. Do we want to give people the option to decline it? We could, or we could just say, you're not on the schedule for 21 days and you're going to receive your regular paycheck. And I think we have the option to do that.
Do we require them to take any type of? I thought we funded some I'm gonna get the wrong term, so I hope nobody's offended, but psychological help or whatever. Do we require any type of training or, decompression therapy or whatever from that?
Yeah, so we require an annual checkup from the neck up. So they are required to meet with one of our contracted police, therapists, or with Ridgway and Associates, psychologists.
Okay.
And I can share my experience. So how the conversations go is when we're meeting with the psychologist, they talk about, what do you do for self-care? Are you sleeping okay? Or they start out with, how are things going? It's very conversational, but the lines and the topics that they get to are, anything going on? What are the stressors? What things cause you stress in your life? What things are going good? But they do focus on, what are you doing to take care of yourself? They talk, what can you do to help, further those goals? If you like to read, what books are you reading now? Are you in a book club? And so they kind of encourage officers to go down that route. It's more of an exercise in verbalizing. And, one of the things that, I can share, when I was in them, I'm like, well, these are the things I like to do. And they're like, well, when was the last time that you did that? And I'm like, 3 years ago. Like, you should prioritize that. So they do a good job of making you verbalize when you aren't doing a good job on certain things. And to that degree, they exercise, but there's nothing else that's really mandated.
Yeah, I was just thinking for sabbaticals for mental health. It'd be nice that they utilize some of that time to actually focus on that versus just going fishing, or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm happy to go fishing with them, but.
Yeah, I think, I don't know to what our ability is to mandate during that, but if they're work hours, I think we could set some expectations. How far we can go with that, or what their participation level is. I mean, especially if we're paying them, we could say, you're off the road for 21 days and you're going to go do X, Y, and Z. The only thing is it can't have, for instance, as soon as those would become a fitness for duty concern or report back, that becomes a union issue. Right now, we are detached. The psychologists that our officers meet with don't call me up and say, hey,
Yeah.
you know, that's going on. So, and if it did, then that would become when there would need to be union considerations and negotiations for those requirements. So we'd have to temper what requirements we would have that could impact employment if we're going to require them to do non-police officer type things. But I think your point is well taken that what I don't want is a person to take a 21-day sabbatical and then go work their part-time job for 21 days full-time. That's not the intent of it. So I think be open to ideas on how do we require that recuperation, rebuilding during those 21 days that they are focusing on themselves. That's definitely a consideration.
Because they get earned PTO right now, right?
Yes.
So it'd be nice if this is used for something in addition to just PTO.
Mhm. And I would envision people probably using PTO on either end of it if it was able to be facilitated. So if they got a 21-day sabbatical, they might take a week after that or a week before that as well.
Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
I'll go a different direction for 5 minutes. What did the union get for their officers on all of these things we're talking about right now? What benefits are there now, or is there no conversation during union negotiations related to retention, those kind of things? Do you know what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, so this was intentionally kept as a separate conversation from the contract negotiations for a couple of reasons. I believe that the compensation and the items that were currently included in the contract needed to stand on its own merits and be competitive
Okay,
on their own. So that's not to say there was strong interest, but I think from the beginning, I said I wanted these to be separate but parallel conversations. And I also wanted to have the flexibility for the council to look at this data, evaluate it like you did in the survey, and form it in the best interest of the officers rather than it becoming sometimes in union negotiations, it can be, well, what's going to benefit the most senior person or what's going to benefit the greatest number. And all of a sudden, something that is intended to function a certain way, like a sabbatical, now you're arguing over 21 days versus
All right.
17 days. So they've been the officers and the union members have been a part of the conversation. It's been talked about, but they've been very much kept in their same lane to keep this conversation tonight about these items.
that's all I was wondering, and great job on this. And Jeremy, John, it's a lot of work. A lot of thought.
Any other thoughts? I think those three that were supported by staff and by Jeremy John subcommittee, what is that subcommittee called?
Subcommittee?
Bottom.
Or whatever you guys did to create.
The survey sub.
Survey subcommittee.
And I think what we were hoping for tonight is to get some direction from the council on what to bring back in a staff report for adoption or a plan or some direction that's what we'd be looking for. And then I think the follow-up conversation is going to naturally be, what does this mean for other city staff?
Quick question.
Yeah.
The paid sabbatical, we wouldn't actually accrue carrying cost until we get an officer to the point where they would be ready to take one, correct?
Correct.
How would the phase in work such that we don't end up with every officer eligible in the same year?
Right, that's gonna be, you tell me how you want to do it. What I would recommend is probably going by seniority. The people that have been here 20 years should probably receive a sabbatical prior to somebody who's been here 5. So I would probably look at the seniority list and say, okay, we can accommodate. So I'm trying to remember, we're at 13 full-time. I'm trying to remember how the staggering worked out, but I think we looked at, so over a 4-year period, you'd probably have 3 people out on sabbatical
Per year?
So what we would do is look at, if we decided to go down that route, look at 2024, choose what, we'd black out 3 months saying, okay, you can't go during these months because we have the summer events or whatever that might be. And then we would start by seniority and say, when would you like to have your sabbatical? Work backwards, then probably pick the next most senior person, get them on the schedule. And we could, in essence, begin scheduling 25 sabbaticals and 26 as sabbaticals once we know that this would be a real thing, because we can look at, you know, accommodating for staffing earlier to there. So there, you know, the idea is to backfill primarily with part-time officers. There could be a scenario where we this is based on what it would cost to backfill with part-time officers. Maybe there's not part-time officers available. There could be a time where we incur overtime costs to cover that shift. And I said earlier, could go the other way as well, that we might not need to backfill all of those shifts either. If we have, you know, shift overlap, or it's during a particularly slow time, we might not, there might be shifts we don't have to backfill depending on where they're at on the schedule. So
So I guess what I would like to see, if we're all on board with vacation reimbursement being the first thing, we got budget for that, we could start that. I'd like to understand how we would approach the paid sabbatical. And figure out a plan from staff's perspective that is workable for getting everybody online with that. In a way that still provides adequate safety coverage.
can you clarify what you'd be looking for in the plan? Or would you like me to try and explain an idea on it, or would you like to see something in paper brought
I
forward?
think when we go to adopt something,
Sure.
it would be good to understand how the mechanics of that would work. Given we want to do this every 4 years, but we don't want everybody immediately taking them. So
Right.
how that clock would start
A phased
for each
approach.
person once they take their first one, and how that would work out.
Right, what the phased approach would look like.
And then I would imagine the health insurance one would take some considerable study with attorneys. Maybe that's something for later this year that we would think about.
Yeah, I've, in the context of other conversations, brought the topic up with our attorney when I was talking about other items, and said that he thought there would be some things to look at, and it would obviously take a little bit of brainstorming, but I think he was, at least upon first glance, thought that there was probably a way to go there. And to Alan's point, we'd want to know what the risks are of when could somebody receive this that we're not seeing.
Jason?
Well. So one of the questions was. At the end of the packet, council should consider items appropriate for non-police staff. I think you made the point that early on that sabbatical and vacation reimbursement talks to the mental health side. So personally, I don't see sabbatical and vacation reimbursement going beyond the police department.
Agree.
Retirement thing, we'd have to look at that because that's different, right? We don't have a 55 eligibility or
Right.
whatever for non-police. I think that question really gears more around some of the other things that scored really low on the survey, like hiring referral bonuses, or, educational incentives and other things like that. I could see what non-police could fit in. But for me, the ones we're talking about tonight
Specific to the police.
There are
specific to the police department in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. Do you have any thoughts on that, Matt?
No, I like I said, I think one of the thoughts would be, I think there are other employees in the city that feel like, they're feeling the pinch of hiring and recruitment as well. And they're seeing action taken on police, and they want to know, what can we do for our departments? And I think if it's not this, and it might be, I don't know if it needs to stand on its own or what that is, but I think they want to know. We recognize the police need help. We're not saying that, but we're struggling to find people to how do we get help? Is the question that we as staff have to answer when it relates to that.
Yeah, no, I get that, and I get the idea of we've had parallel benefit tracks, right? But to me, to really sell this to somebody in the community that we're gonna give a police officer 21 days sabbatical every 4 years for mental health, and say we're gonna give the same thing to somebody that drives the snowplow is a hard sell.
But maybe there's a different benefit in here that.
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking. We're gonna have to start going down a path where we're gonna start splitting.
Mhm.
And we really need to think of that about what's core benefits that apply to everybody, and what's benefits that apply to certain departments based on, you know, work conditions.
Right.
So the vacation reimbursement, I've seen it in other cities where they do it for the whole city because you want people to take their PTO and you want them to get away from the office to get that work-life balance piece. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't or shouldn't do that, but just my experience, I've seen it in other cities be branded in that way to make sure your people are actually taking time to get away.
Yeah, and I've seen a challenge with getting staff across the board in every department to be able to use their PTO. That, and I think if they had we talk about, the carryover 3 years versus 4 years, but if you start losing that carryover, if you haven't used it in 3 or 4 years, it creates that incentive to.
Yeah, I mean, in the private sector, well, I can speak for the company that I work for, it's a use it or lose it every year, right? And people lose it continuously. And it's not from a financial aspect of it. I mean, you can go home and sit on your couch as far as I care, just use your time. And whatever, it's not gonna cost you anything, but I have a hard time reimbursing just somebody, most people don't take vacation time because they feel they can't take vacation time because the work's piling up, and that's just a function of capacity and staffing.
The other point of clarification that I brought up and didn't hear feedback, do you have a consideration on, when we talk about the retirement health insurance entitlement? Creating because we know we won't incur the full liability every year because people wouldn't be eligible. Does the council want to consider doing like a 5-year look back? So that if we have for instance, right now, if we had a 15-year employee that was looking at going to another agency, they would be walking away from 5 years times, 150 months. So what does that come out to be per year? I mean, walking away from $10,000 to $12,000 that would be a retirement entitlement that they would be leaving today. Is there any appetite for a look back on when they would have started accruing that entitlement? Or is it starting at what date?
I'm personally open to it because it's a recruitment process. I'd have to know numbers wise, what the look back means that we have to fund tomorrow. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because the further we look back, the more we have to fund today. Or the more we have to contribute on a monthly basis going forward to make up that gap.
Can the city invest the money that we allocate toward that to help make up some of the value?
The city could choose to fund it how
I
they wanted to.
think that we could look at options. We can I'd have to verify that, but generally, most of the money we set aside, we generally have some flexibility in investing it. It depends on how the rates are doing, and we are generally pretty conservative, so we probably wouldn't make a lot of interest on however we would do it, but certainly a way to supplement that.
So I do have a quick math on the look back. For instance, if there was going to be considered a 5-year look back, at $150 a month, it would be $1,800 a year per employee is what that comes out to be. So $1,800 per year per employee. $1,800 looking back 5 years is $9,000. So, and of that, there are 5 police department employees that would qualify for that. So if you look at the years of service at the bottom, working backwards, there's a 29-year, a 26-year, 15-year, 7-year, 7-year. The next officer would be a 2. So then we have a 2, 1.5, 1.5, 1, 1.5. Their accrual would be $1,800 a year, but much less.
So would you structure it so no credit would be given to new employees with prior law enforcement experience? So if they're coming from another agency with 10 years, we wouldn't give them credit for the 5.
Right. I think it's in whatever your vision is. I think what I would
Within the city.
what I would recommend is a minimum of, set that bar. So if we said you had to be, I don't know if we want to say 53, which is typical, your standard retirement age. If we want to extend it that you have to stay till 55 to receive that value, Those would be, or you want to make it that you're eligible at 50, because some other life circumstances made it possible. That might also, and this is off the cuff without any forethought, the city could offer to extend that, if you wanted to encourage retirements at some point, you could probably flex that down if you wanted to for 1 year or whatever, but going back to it, I think we'd want to pick a date, whether that's age, you must be age 50, you must be age 55, must be age 53. And I would say must have worked for the city for a minimum of 10 years. If you want to be able to hire somebody that's, 40 or 45, or give that opportunity to a lot of people that, if you said you have to work here for 30 years, that might be that might be a less effective recruitment tool. But I think if you said you got to be here 10 years and reach a certain age and be drawing your retirement, those seem reasonable to me, but that's really at your at your direction. I would, if you asked me what my opinion was, I would say I would recommend doing age 53, just because that's when other things would probably start aligning for that. Part is when eligibility would happen. I would say minimum age 53 would be my recommendation, but you could set that at whatever you wanted to. I don't necessarily want people sticking around till 65 in this role. Certainly could be whatever your vision for it is.
Isn't there a formula with retirement? What's like your age and years of service?
Yeah,
Tie it
yeah.
similar to something like that.
yeah. So for instance, the police pension is 3%. So they take the average of the highest 5 consecutive years, take any 5-year band in there, and whichever ones average out to be the highest, that's your high 5. In the police and fire pension, you receive 3% of your high 5 for each year of service. So at 30 years, you would receive 90% of your high 5.
For benefit. But isn't there a formula at which point you can retire and start drawing benefits?
No, this is when you have a penalty of 1.4% per year for every year before age 55 that you can retire.
Okay.
So the penalty works backwards from 55. So what you'll see is a lot of people work till 53. They'll have roughly 20 years of service, which puts them at 90%. They'll have 2 years of penalty, which brings them back down to like an 85. However, the police officers pay roughly 14% of their pay. Is it 14, Jess? % of the paycheck that goes into para. So
17 and 11.
So 11% is the employee contribution. So typically, once they hit that age 33 they get their 90%, but they have a couple years penalty. That's usually about the break even point for a lot of the officers, depending on when they started.
So the formula is really backing down a reduction in their full benefits.
Yes,
Okay.
or every year before age
I
55.
think the teachers have a similar thing like that, where their age plus service years hits to a certain number and they can retire at full benefit or whatever.
And just a note about para, the officers can't put into social security, so para is higher for them than it would be other.
Right, the officers aren't allowed social security, and because you're paying into para, the officers don't pay into social security, and then also they're subject to the windfall elimination provision. So even if they had and the government pension offset, so even if they had qualifying credits, as I do, for instance, my benefit would be reduced almost to 0 because I'm receiving a state pension benefit. So they eliminate, even though I paid into social security, I can't really ever draw that.
For teachers, it's the rule of 90. When years of service and age equal 90.
You can retire. That's what I was thinking about. If years of service and your age are a certain point, that's when you can start drawing or something from this.
Yeah, that'd be
They did take the rule of 90 for the public sector. They got rid of that in 1989.
But I think Alan's saying that's the form. You could use a similar formula for eligibility for that retirement entitlement is where you're going with. And I think that's an option too, saying that years of service, must be a minimum of 10, but years of service and age must equal whatever number. That's a possibility.
Yeah, I think you could structure something so it's a good incentive for the employee, but a really good incentive for the city as well.
So, yeah, so I mean, that's a 5-year look back on that with the $9,000 a year times the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 employees. That would be an additional at the end of the day for 5 employees, 45,000. Another one would be about 3,000, 2,000 would be smaller implications on the remaining 6 or 7 would be around $2,000.
That's 5 years from the date it's implemented, right? If you're as of today, right? So. Let's say I'm a 4-year employee. Next year I hit my 5-year mark. Or is the look back a one-time deal? You know what I'm saying? Is it a
Yeah.
rolling look back kind of?
You tell me.
Can
be.
Either way, yeah.
I mean, it can greatly change the structure of it, so.
Yeah,
When we do get into that discussion, we're gonna have to look at a lot of different options and what the financial impacts are.
We'll need a whiteboard.
Yeah.
on that.
Big one.
For one really big one.
But yeah, I agree. I think. I don't know that we're gonna have a idea of what that is right now, but.
Yeah.
I think that's what we need. That would be our next step, is to figure out that along with the other items, details.
So you'd be interested in hearing an option with a look back, but not still leaving that as a option if you decided to adopt that. And then you can decide at the time of adoption if you're interested in the look back or not.
Yeah, I mean, depending on how it's structured, it's not only retention, but it's also a recruitment tool.
I think that would probably be something we would decide as part of the budgeting process. So understanding what it would look like prior to the budget being penciled in. What is it, typically June or something?
June or July, usually, we'll present in July and August.
So the direction that I'm hearing is bring forward and for the next staff report at a council meeting. Number one, the question I guess would be, we're ready to go to a council meeting with this topic or another work session. I think I was looking to go to a council meeting if possible with the option for implementing the vacation reimbursement starting eligible this year. Allowing the 4-year carryover of that, but that accrual of that benefit or entitlement would start in 2023. Laying out the plan for what the paid sabbatical phasing would be starting in 2024. And seeing how many per year and if it was laid out by seniority and kind of outlining what the structure of the paid sabbatical would be. And then dialing in the language with the city attorney on the additional retirement health insurance entitlement and bring forward either like a formulaic eligibility or kind of dialing in what that would look like. And then show the option if the city wanted to consider a look back of 3 to 5 years. Is that accurate?
Perfect.
And just to clarify, did you want us to look into any other retention options for, we're thinking about retention as a whole as we're looking for next year and beyond for other staff? Is that something you want us to?
One thought I had is maybe if you could take a look at it. I know you mentioned vacation reimbursement, specifically, you've seen that at other cities. If you could maybe put together some information on that, where and how it's been done. And if there anything like the other two as well, that you've seen elsewhere on a wider scale than just police. And even if that's just, it's not completely citywide, let's say it's police and public works or police and general administration or something, just anything broader, just some information on that. So we can kind of see if that works, and then we'll decide if we need to look at other things on a broader basis.
I think it'd be good also to get information on what the turnover rate is